Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Akshat Maini, and I am currently a research assistant at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. It is a matter of great pleasure to extend a warm and humble welcome to all to today's special lecture titled Who is In, Who is Out? Urban Redevelopment, Local Identity, and Vernacular Proficiency in Shanghai. In the last several decades, China has developed at a rapid pace. This development can be seen across the board and quite specifically in China's urban spaces. Among the urban spaces that have been witness to such growth is Shanghai. The transformation of Shanghai into a global city has wiped out whole neighborhoods and driven millions of Shanghainese away from the urban core. Shanghai's transformation can be seen as a manifestation of the China dream, with a built environment closely resembling other global cities. The transformation has borne witness to large-scale internal migration, with state language policies mandating the employment of standard language in place of the vernacular in all spheres of public life. A new urban middle class has also arisen out of the developmental policies of China's economic reform era. The focus of this emergent class has largely been more education level and income based rather than birthplace or political affiliation based, in stark contrast to the Mao era. Situated at the intersection of this phenomenological concepts of place and non-place, individuals' place-bound identity, and tropes of language ideology based on the field research in 2013 and 2017, this research endeavor focuses on how these Chinese urbanities internalize and navigate the transformed urban geographical and sociolinguistic landscape and position themselves in. We are glad to have today's speaker, Dr. Fang Shu, who is an urban sociologist with expertise in language, cultural identity, and public policies in urban China. Her research interests include urban studies, consumption, nationalism, and migration. She is currently continuing lecturer in the Interdisciplinary Studies program at the University of California, Berkeley. She is the author of the book, Silencing Shanghai, Language and Identity in Urban China, which was published in 2020. Chairing today's session is Dr. Anand P. Krishnan. He is a fellow at the Center of Excellence for Himalayan Studies, Shiv Nadar Institution of Eminence, Delhi NCR, and a visiting associate fellow at the ICS. His research interests include labor relations in China and India, labor and supply chains in the global south, state-society relations, and labor's interface with urban questions in East and South Asia. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants will be muted during the presentation. Questions can be posted in the chat box. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option. In both cases, please do include your name and affiliation. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself and ask your question. I shall now hand over to the chair. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Akshat. It gives me great pleasure. Thanks to Akshat and also to the Institute of Chinese Studies for the invitation to chair this and moderate this fascinating, what promises to be a fascinating talk based on, I hope is also on a fascinating book, which in the course of preparing for this session, I had a chance to go through also and look upon it with great amount of interest. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Fang Shu. The introductions Akshat has already done. So I won't take much of the time here. We can go straight into the presentation. But it's very fascinating, especially as I was discussing with Dr. Shu just before we started. I was going through one of her essays, which I think forms part of the book ultimately, which is quite interesting in terms of looking at Shanghai as a global city, but also the pushback against that top-down global narrative, especially with the amount of Shanghainese, native Shanghainese, and also the other side of the story from the non-native Shanghainese. So that's fascinating, and I hope some of the points which I have noted down, I hope to also engage and ask them at the end of this presentation, which I found to be quite interesting. And of course, I hope there are some parallels also to India. So without any further ado, let me hand it over to Dr. Shu. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the introduction to Anand and Aksha. And I'm just going to share the screen. And I'm excited to share my work with the audience as the Institute of Chinese Studies. So the title is Who is In, Who is Out? Urban Redevelopment, Local Identity, and Vernacular Proficiency in Shanghai. So very quickly, how or what triggered this research? I was born and raised in Shanghai in the 80s, and then I finished undergrad in Tongji University in Shanghai before my journey in North America, maybe, may I say that. So in the photo, you can see it is the Shanghai Oriental Art Center. It was in the newly built Pudong area of Shanghai. So what we, for fellows, for people interested in studies, I don't think I need to explain how quickly this east bank of Huangpu River, Pudong, was built quickly, arising from the farmland since the early 1990s. So this very grand performing art center, when I went back to Shanghai in 2009, so that's 2 years after I moved to Vancouver, British Columbia, I went to a classical music concert, Western classical music concert there. Usually, you go to the concerts in the lobby, you would buy the program, kind of the booklets, and then some places free, sometimes you would pay a few dollars. And so I paid to the staff. And then when the staff handed me back the booklet, the program, and the change, since I'm a native Shanghainese, kind of instinctively, I just said thank you in Shanghai dialect, 谢谢, instead of the Mandarin Chinese, 谢谢. So the staff looked at me like she was very surprised. And then she said to, not necessarily really in my face, but she pretty much says like, whoa, like, are you serious? This is like upscale, high-end art center. Like, how, in a way, how dare you to use the vernacular in such a posh, upscale setting? I was just shocked. I was, Shanghai dialect was the vernacular, was the lingua franca of the city. I couldn't imagine being shocked in a public space by speaking the vernacular of the city. So that started a whole project. I started to think what has changed. I left for 2 years, and now my mother tongue is not welcome or be humiliated in public space. So that's how this project got started. And then a little bit sociolinguistic background for people not familiar with various dialects or variations of the languages Han Chinese speak in mainland China. So what is this Shanghai dialect against the background of Mandarin Chinese? So Mandarin Chinese, or 普通话, literally translate to common speech, it is the national language and it is the sole medium of instruction in schools. So basically from kindergarten all the way to college. And then 普通话, Mandarin Chinese proficiency is portrayed by the state and believed by mainland Chinese as the clearest indication of higher educational level and likely higher social status. I think that's kind of straightforward. That's the official language. And then all the schools were taught in this language. So the longer you stayed in schools, the longer time you're immersed in this official language. And then likely higher educational status, and then you translate to higher social status in the market economy. And then that is the policy across the country, right? Mandarin Chinese in schools, in public space. But what is unique about Shanghai? People here know probably in the early 20th century or late 19th century, Shanghai was a semi-colony of various imperialist powers, and Shanghai dialects was born during kind of the urban version during those colonial times. So Shanghai dialect as an urban dialect is phonologically, syntactically, and lexically different from Putonghua and the other non-Wu Chinese languages. So the Wu Chinese languages is a language family dominant the Yangtze River Delta region for thousands of years. But Shanghai dialect itself, its variation is fairly new, like just slightly more than 100 years. And then this urban dialect has no standardized written form, unlike, say, Cantonese, used still a lot by diaspora Chinese overseas. And then in this cosmopolitan Shanghai has been cosmopolitan 100 years, language has historically played an important role in social exclusion and discrimination. It is a migrant city. So in early 20th century, more than 85% of the residents in Shanghai, talk about urban Shanghai, in Chinese occupied regions, in French occupied, in English and US occupied regions, 85% of the Chinese population then were migrants and first generation migrants. And then they were war or natural disaster refugees from northern Jiangsu province. And they were discriminated against because they were poor, including their accent in speaking the dialect. There were research on this language-based discrimination in Shanghai by Emily Hornish. She's in UC San Diego, I think. She studied that in the 80s. And then, so it has translated into this common practice in Shanghai that you listen to whether that individual you encounter in public space could speak Shanghai dialect. If they could, what kind of accent? If they have the northern accent, that means they were poor working class migrants from Jiangsu, northern Jiangsu province. If they don't have that accent, they are more welcome to the city. So the current tendency for discrimination was not just started when the market economic reform or the language policy in the 2000s. It has its historical roots in Shanghai. So this is a bit sociolinguistic background. And in the introduction, Professor Anar mentioned my work about urban studies. So a little bit socio-geographic background about this language change. So demographic change, according to the 1990 census, there were 13 million population in Shanghai. And then when we look in 2018, or even more recently, 2020, 21, there were 24 million, excuse me. So the additional 11 million, they are mostly due to internal migrants. So how are you going to house so many people and then providing work and social amenities for all these people? Right? There's this urbanization process. Changes to the urban landscape starting in the early 1990s. Well, early on, the photo of Pudong, it was farmland, and now you see all those apartment buildings, CBD areas, and elevated expressways. So here's kind of my modification of the map of Shanghai. And on the left-hand side, you can see it's kind of in the center. It's almost like a heart. This SH proper, it's Shanghai proper, I think, in native Shanghainese mind, that is the urban area. And then all these other places around this Shanghai proper, including Chongming Island, they were classified as rural. For China studies scholars, you're aware there's not necessarily this Western or American concept of suburbs. It's either rural or urban. So, and then all these years underneath, 2001, 1991 or 2016, in red, all these years were when those rural counties were classified as urban. So it was really farmland, and now they are all urban districts. And then when we look at the right-hand side, so that is the urban district, used to be the only urban district in Shanghai. So what happens? Outwardly, that's the urbanization, but inwardly, within the previous urban regions, we have seen this consolidation of urban districts. So we can see in the center, this Jing'an district, that's where I grew up in. So that was part of the, what do they call it? It used to be jointly ruled by UK and the US. And then together with the Huangpu district. So it's kind of the waterfront and center, and then center of business and commerce. And then, so what happened to these like center urban districts? Under the Huangpu, you can see Luwan, and then besides Luwan, there is, it was already non-existent when I created this map, is the Nanshi. So the Nanshi districts incorporate into Huangpu. What used to be, if you look at the old map of Shanghai 100 years ago, it used to be called the Chinese city. And that's absurd, right? We're talking about Shanghai. It's within China. Why there is a place called the Chinese city? Because all around now Nanshi, well, previously Nanshi, were all foreign settlements. So the Nanshi used to be the Chinese city, and Luwan used to be the French concession. Huangpu and Jing'an used to be ruled by UK and US. And it's not legend, has it? The fact is, even though they are all Chinese territories, but it was leased to the imperialist powers. And then the difference between Jing'an and Luwan, it could be not only public transit didn't go through, and they have different jurisdictions or government, even the power outlets on the walls, the voltage is different. In the Jing'an and Huangpu, it's American standard 110 or 120, and then Luwan is the European one, 220. So you can't even buy electronic appliances and move to another district. It didn't work. It wouldn't work. So that's how bizarre and how fragmented the Shanghai urban landscape used to be. And that was the background when people felt so uncomfortable when those urban districts merged. So Huangpu and Luwan were merged into the new Huangpu district in 2011. And then the Jing'an, the used to be posh neighborhood, merged with Zhabei district north of it. Zhabei used to be like kind of infamous for urban poor. So now it becomes a new Jing'an. So, there's lots of clashes when people take pride in, say, the fancy neighborhood they live in, and suddenly that neighborhood doesn't exist anymore, like Luwan or Nanshi, or people lived in Jing'an used to discriminate against urban poor living in shanty towns in Zhabei. Now they're the same Jing'an districts, right? So there's lots of things challenge the mental mapping of residents in Shanghai. In the same period, as previously mentioned in the introduction, more than 1 million households of native Shanghainese were displaced in the urban redevelopment process. So there are lots of movements on the map or in everyday people's lives. And what I try to capture in the process is, yes, people moved away, and what happened next, right? So very quickly, the analytical framework, I use Proficiency's environmental psychological concept, urban place identity. What does it mean is you grew up in a place, and then life events, your memories, and then your identification with the space, with who you are, is always associated with physical settings. And you're comfortable navigating, say, a shanty town or a commercial streets. And all these are part of you, so to speak. This level of ease, or maybe even anxiety, is who you are in the urban space. And then there's this trope of right to the city on displacees fighting to reclaim their city. It's not only in studies about gentrification, but also various struggles to assert their rights. And then Pierre Bourdieu's argument of a linguistic capital, it's kind of a subsection of his work on cultural capital, but basically why I found it's very useful is the convertibility of linguistic capital. Knowledge of one language can be converted to economic capital, can be converted into social capital and counters. And then lastly, a little bit moving away from urban studies or sociology is in the trope of language ideologies, notions commonly usually talked about in social linguistics. So it was suggest, give an example by Urban, is that it means the cultural system of ideas about social and linguistic relationships, together with their loading of moral and political interests. There is a correct language to speak. We are not talking linguistically, grammatically correctness, but how language spoken or usage is projected onto the characteristics of the speakers, their social status, their authority, their power, and this performance of speaking or utterance. Quickly, and then let's move on to research questions. And all those photos I took during the fieldwork, I'm trying to show it's diverse, it's have old buildings, new buildings, lots of people encounter, and then what kind of language they would use in those encounters. So the social research questions are, what are the factors contributing to the endangerment of Shanghai dialect? Previous study has already shown those quantitative, mostly based studies show that the younger generations of native Shanghainese do not necessarily speak the dialects. And then I also want to know, what has the city's transformation of built environment in the last 2 decades to do with the dialect endangerments? You might think that, is that kind of stretch? Like, you talk about language, it's kind of intangible, and then this urban built environment is really in your face. What is the connection? And then lastly, with the decline of Shanghai dialect competence across the city, does it still count as significant marker of Shanghairen or Shanghai people identity, or does anyone still care to be a Shanghairen? That used to be, this is an exclusive, you can say, label, and then language is often used to discriminate between Shanghairen or country bumpkins. So that's why the title of today's presentation is like, who's in, who's out, whether it still matters, and then whether language can still be an effective marker for discrimination, if you want. Research methods, what I've done over years, exploration of the definition of Shanghairen identity in relation to dialect competence within the broader context of state language policies, urban redevelopment policies, and the migration policy. So 3 sets of state policies. And then I did qualitative observations for half year, and then semi-structured interviews with 50 native Shanghairen of different age group, economic background, educational backgrounds, and then gender. And then 20 highly educated migrants. So with the native Shanghainese, those interviews were done in 2013, and then internal migrants interviews were done in 2017, and I collected 250 survey responses. So I would say the survey responses are relatively biased because I was not able to distribute it as widely I would like to, so it relied on the snowball sampling. So I do not want to claim the survey response can be generalized to the whole city population, but we can still see what the survey says, the kind of the trend it represents. And actually also it corresponds to previous studies, quantitative-based studies. But the strength, I would say, that in this work is qualitative. Okay, so findings. So decades of promotion of Mandarin Chinese through language policies and surveillance mechanisms results in the dominance of Putonghua speaking in public. So starting in 1958, the central state in Beijing had already issued policies requiring Mandarin Chinese used in schools of all levels and in government agencies, but it was not really taken on, you may say, but it started to get more vigilance in the last 20 years. So this is an example of a college classroom door. And for those who read Chinese, you can tell. So what it says is, please speak Putonghua, please write in standardized characters. And that's just a sticker on the door of college classrooms. And so it's constant reminder what is the proper language? In the college setting, the same slogan. In the should I check? Oh, sorry, I was just checking the chat box. Okay. And then the second photo is taken at a clinic lobby. And then you can see in the corner, top right corner, there's a number, the next patient, they're calling, and it's the same thing, public space. And that placard is facing the public, right? It's not regulating the employees, but it's letting everyone in the waiting area know this space, we need you to speak Putonghua. And then the last one is, I'm showing here the plaza outside the Shanghai Grand Theater, and then the arrow is pointing to the box office. I interviewed the deputy manager of, that's 2013, of the Shanghai Grand Theater, and she was telling me, you know, there is this bureau in the municipal government. They will send investigators covertly to our box office and then inquire about the performance, saying, oh, do you have tickets for this or that show? And deliberately to test, to investigate whether our staff would slip out some Shanghai dialect when facing clients. And or even like they would talk to security guards to see whether they would use Mandarin Chinese throughout. So, and then the deputy manager says, we would never know when the government come to investigate. And we only know they have already been here, talked to our staff covertly, pretending to be a client, until later on when they send us the report saying your staff is not doing 100% or in Putonghua speaking. So there's this constant reminder and constant surveillance of public space. And then let's look at the language practice in public. So these percentages were drawn from the survey data, and I categorized to ask them whether they solely speak Putonghua or mix with predominantly Putonghua, or solely Shanghai dialect mixed with predominantly Shanghai dialect, or equally mixed. I imagine or asked a few scenarios, government agencies, healthcare facilities, retail shopping areas, or leisure venues, movie theaters, gym, or park, and then public transit hubs. You ask for directions and buying tickets. So all these, we can see the survey results are from 250 native Shanghainese who have Shanghai dialect as their mother tongue. And then we know Shanghai dialect is so different from Mandarin Chinese. And people, even I, would say we need to switch brains, almost like talking, speaking a foreign language. And we can see predominantly people either use solely Putonghua or mix with predominantly Putonghua. This language shift has already happened. And then mostly adding these two columns together, we can see probably across board 2/3 respondents are saying they mostly use Putonghua in public. And I also explained why I was shocked at Oriental Art Center when I used Shanghai dialect, because people are not used to hear it in public space anymore. And then how do I connect this with those big terms, Shanghai, realizing the China dream through Putonghua speaking? So there's this Bourdieusian capital conversions made possible in the economic reform era. As I mentioned, the language policy, the first round of language policy was issued in the 1950s. That was still Maoist era, planned economy, everything top down. And then in the current and the most recent constitution, the fourth constitution of China, it mandates Putonghua speaking, but still people use vernacular, not only in Shanghai, but other places, because, you know, there's very limited mobility. We almost go back to the industrial revolution here. There's very limited mobility. You were born and raised, spend most of your life locally, and then speak vernacular, get you everywhere and get things done. And you don't encounter much outsiders, so to speak. And then no one really policing. You can say there's surveillance, but then what, right? Not necessary motivations for you to acquire to speak 普通话. But interestingly, the big shift happened during the economic reform era, because the state in the last 10 years and this presidency, it was very clear that if you speak 普通话 well, there will be better educational opportunities, better job opportunities. Those are real material incentives, understood and absorbed and taken in by native Shanghainese, saying that, well, it's kind of the whole market economy delivered if I change the language I speak. That is the practical side. And then we're looking at what kind of the emotional, cultural side is that even though native Shanghainese buy into the state rhetoric, promising the conversion from linguistic capital of Mandarin Chinese to tangible material outcomes, but Shanghainese still feel ambivalence of the connection between this local prestigious identity and dialect proficiency. So Jerry, he is a Shanghainese, college educated in his mid-30s, and he told me during an interview, quote, firstly, whoever can speak Shanghai dialect is definitely a Shanghairen. Straightforward. I mean, whoever can speak accent-free Shanghai dialect, I underscore it, that's heavily loaded. What do you mean by accent-free? You can identify that person as a genuine Shanghairen. However, it is not necessarily true that those who are unable to speak the dialect are outlanders. So I want to emphasize this word outlanders. It's not just meaning an outsider or internal migrants. Outlanders, or in Mandarin Chinese, 外地人, it's a derogatory term. And it has all these loaded associations with not highly educated, vulgar, backwards. So it's not just a plain neutral insider versus outsider distinction. So what Jerry says is, who are unable to speak, not necessarily true that those who are unable to speak the dialects are outlanders. I regard those with Shanghai 户口 legal status, living in Shanghai for years and having no intention for leaving as Shanghairen. So he gave 3 criteria already. Legally, you need to permit it by the state. And then you probably need to have a solid and stable income so that you can afford to live in Shanghai for years. And also kind of emotionally, you have the attachment, you don't want to leave. So 3 levels, Jerry already gave the criteria. At the end of the day, he said, even if you fulfill all that, but at the level of acceptance, he only recognized those who are able to speak the dialect. Now dialect coming in. He said, I would regard them as Shanghairen from head to toe. Otherwise, the recognition stops at the surface. If in the Shanghairen circle, when you speak 普通话, it will still be very difficult, if not impossible, for us to accept you as a Shanghairen. So after fulfilling all the criteria and requirements, and now you're face to face with this internal migrants. Imagine highly educated, middle class, and then fellow Han Chinese, not to mention. But for Jerry, communication, casual talk, chit chat, if Jerry needs to switch from Shanghai dialect to 普通话, he still feels there is this barrier, very obvious barrier. And then he couldn't accept that person as a Shanghairen. So dialect still holds some power there. And then a more extreme, when we talk about social encounters. So native Shanghairen feels like victimized. It's not in the US, there was the narrative about, oh, migrants steal our jobs. That's not the dominant narrative in Shanghai. What is dominant in Shanghai is that it's fine, you come here, you bring business, even though we suspect you use lots of our resources. That's such a cliche saying about complain about immigrants all around the world, I would say. But Peter is saying that, well, we can coexist, but your presence, the migrant's presence, actually infringe my rights. He's a little bit older. Peter found migrants' language, attitude, and practice disrespectful. His mindset is that in Rome, do as Romans do. So he says their attitude, talking about migrants, their attitude is, I don't understand dialect, so no one is allowed to speak it when I'm around, even though the communication is between Shanghairen and I'm not part of it. So he says, I'm talking with, say, my partner in my vernacular language, and then you as a migrant policing me in my home country or my home city because you don't understand what I'm saying to my partner, which is none of your business. And so he just felt like his linguistic rights is challenged by the presence, by this argument of migrants. So we can see this kind of getting more intense. And let's hear what the internal migrants say. Right? That's why I felt I really needed to do interviews with the internal migrant to hear their side of the story. And Helen, she came from Harbin in northeastern China upon graduation from college there, and she actually married a Shanghairen. And she reminded us that in the early 2000s, language-based discrimination was prevalent in Shanghai. And she said she remembered the wide usage of Shanghai dialect when you run errands or deal with government agencies. There was definitely a language barrier. As migrants, they have all experienced rejection and discrimination by Shanghairen. But it didn't force Helen to learn the dialect. She only wanted to understand it to carry out those activities, but never want to learn it. So that's kind of the backfire. She is well aware the benefits of learning Shanghai dialect since she married into a Shanghairen family. But because of those discriminations she experienced, so this language, the vernacular Shanghai dialect, is associated with hostility, associated with certain kind of characteristics she doesn't want to take up when she pick up this language. And then other internal migrants told me stories like in the early 2000s, the public transit system didn't have automatic announcements of what is the next bus stop is. And there is this conductor selling tickets and announcing stops on board. And those were native Shanghainese. So all those announcements were made in the dialect. And then for internal migrants who didn't speak the dialect, they would miss stops. They didn't know what the announcement was. And then no one showed any sympathy for the missing stops, because the justification is it was your own fault why you came to Shanghai but didn't learn the dialect. Right? And so that was what happens and then government agencies would give internal migrants dirty looks if the migrants didn't speak the Shanghai dialect, even though those government officials are supposed to speak Mandarin Chinese, right, by the state decree. So that was the linguistic environment.
Shu, sorry to intervene. I think we have about 5 more minutes.
I have 2 more slides.
Oh, no problem.
It's all good. Yeah. The concept next I want to introduce, again, stemming from research with internal migrants, is they don't care whether they are judged as a Shanghairen or not. And when Shanghainese are still debating whether we count you in or count you out, affluent internal migrants, they embodied what I call flexible resident identity. So the household registration status or legal status, their legal status is still associated with birthplace elsewhere in China, not Shanghai. And then they acquired a resident permit issued by the Shanghai municipal government to live and work legally in Shanghai. And then some of them are affluent enough to acquire American green card. So I interviewed this upper middle class woman originated from inland China. She described her wealthy friends who acquire American permanent residencies through investment-based EB-5 program. So we're talking about people very rich. So since November 2019, under the President Trump, the bar raised from $500,000 US to $900,000 US to qualify for this investment-based immigration program. So Margaret says, it's much easier to make money here, meaning Shanghai, in China than abroad. Of course, her wealthy friends don't want to migrate to another country. Rather, they prefer to live in Shanghai. They regard a green card as a security measure just in case if anything bad happens in China and they need to leave for safety, financial, or other reasons. At least they have the option. The property they bought in the US is just for an annual vacation or to accumulate days living in that country to maintain their permanent resident status. When need to do that on a regular basis. If you ask them to settle down abroad, they will never want to. So they are the upper class privileged in China. And then if they, even with the money, moving to the US, they will become second-class citizens. So, and then they don't necessarily care about where they live. It could just be someplace very easy for business and then material comfort. So to conclude, we heard from native Shanghainese, we heard from internal migrants, and then I suggest the spectrum of acceptance and the linkage between Shanghai dialect proficiency and the Shanghaian identity indicate that the fluency of the dialect persists as a gatekeeper of the local identity. However, it's not necessarily something people still desire as, say, decades ago, internal migrants. And then the existing bilingualism among many native Shanghaian, the younger generation especially, the rising Putonghua monolingualism, even among native Shanghainese youth. They don't speak the Shanghai dialect at all, and they don't even have Shanghai dialect accent when they speak Putonghua. It provides actually a less discriminative linguistic environment for immigrants or migrants in Shanghai. So there's always two sides of the story. And lastly, Shanghai dialect may survive as an urban linguistic subculture. It's not lingua franca anymore. It's survived as an online subculture in the form of video log or TikTok to grasp attentions. And then under COVID, I did observe more usage of the Shanghai dialect by the middle-aged Shanghainese, because young people do not speak it anymore, to bypass state censorship, because the apparently generative AI were trained on Putonghua, not on dialects. So I'm still following up on this trends, but that wrapped up today's presentation. So if you're interested to learn more about this research, and there's a picture of my book, and there's also the QR code of it. So that's all.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Shu. It was really fascinating. Especially, I found a lot of those points really, I mean, if you think really hard for all of those here in India, I think a lot of this has a lot of relevance, and we do find things even in India, because as you correctly pointed out, whether it is this one hand, you have this standardized Putonghua, the Mandarin language, standardized and from a top down from the Chinese party state, and that prevails across the country, and it goes to the other extent. I mean, the pervasiveness of that is really very hard within China. I mean, the dialects I'll come to a bit, but even other languages, like even minority education and the bilingual language policy itself is now to be questioned. I mean, Xi Jinping's latest visit to Xinjiang, where he, among his speech, he's constantly emphasizing, I think one point he's hammering in is that the standard Chinese language has to be taught resolutely. I mean, those are the words he's using. So one of it is that. But on the other hand, as your research very interestingly points out, is the other dimension of tendencies of regional chauvinism in terms of language, accept migrants, having very negative connotations of migrants, some kind of gatekeeping, as you correctly point out. So this balance between two forms of language politics is I find a lot of resonance even in India. So I think that is a measure which is something to take home even here. I was wanting, I think there was Dr. Suresh at the beginning of the presentation. Is he still here? Because he has done a comparative work on Delhi and Shanghai. This is mainly on construction labor, but I think he's not there anymore. So I thought of bringing him in first because of his familiarity, and it's also the work he has done to begin the Q&A. But I think since he's not there, the first question came in from Professor Patricia Oberoi. Ma'am, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question rather than me reading out, if it's fine with you? Hello.
I read the question. I can.
Yeah. I think you can, because she can, because I thought if she wants to use unmute and ask the question, but I think in case if you have seen the question, I think you can go ahead, because those are questions on the use of Shanghai dialect in communities abroad, say in Hong Kong, and the other question which she has subsequently asked is the use of Shanghai dialect in performance, music, stand-up comedy, so on and so forth.
Yeah. Happy to engage with this conversation about Shanghai dialect used in Chinese immigrant or diaspora communities abroad, say in the US or Canada, Australia, and then or maybe in Hong Kong. I'm not sure about right now in Hong Kong, but when Chinese Communist Party took over before that, there was exodus of rich Shanghainese landed, migrated to Hong Kong. So there used to be kind of you can say kind of enclave of Little Shanghai in Hong Kong, starting in the 40s, or maybe even the 1940s, even earlier. And that's where all those in the famous director Wong Kar-wai's films, you have heard all those like Shanghai dialect usage. So that was before, but I would say in Chinese communities abroad, Shanghainese are infamous for not really interacting with Chinese migrants from other parts of the country. So there is this, how to say, self-grandization rooted in this cosmopolitan Shanghai and Shanghai identity in China. It was carried over through the Shanghainese immigrants to America or Canada or Australia, and they feel they are better than the rest of the Chinese. So they have their own community within the Chinese immigrants community. They would have, you can't say they discriminate against other immigrants, but they would have their own still small circle. They would communicate in Shanghai dialect, but that's just a first generation immigrant. They don't really necessarily pass down the dialect to their children. It might be a domestic language. They speak with their children, but you can't expect American-born second generation Shanghainese, can say Shanghainese American speak Shanghai dialect much, because that's kind of linked to my current project about heritage language learning, and then the identity, the in-between immigrant identity. So there are subcultural Shanghai dialects rap songs more recently, but there was vernacular theater in Shanghai dialect. So there's the Shanghai dialect opera, 沪剧, or there is stand-up comedy in Shanghai dialect called the 滑稽戏. I had a book chapter about this. So like 15 years ago, there was this actor, a stand-up comedian, got really, really popular, sold out books, sold out shows. And he talked about how Shanghai has changed in the last 30 years. So it's more like since 1980s to the early 2010s. And then lots of the messages in those Shanghai dialect-based performance or performing art products are actually discriminated against outlanders. So it was used as a tool of ridicule and then put down immigrants, elevating the status of Shanghainese. So you can say the core message actually in lots of those products are xenophobic, unfortunately. And then, but it's almost like the right-wing politics. It gets the followers who are xenophobic to start with. So with that kind of underlying message, it's very hard to get wide public support. And of course, it would likely to be censored by the state. So, but what is more interesting about performing arts using Shanghai dialect is that local artists, they started by using Shanghai dialect to sing songs, to stage comedy shows. They want to go big. They want to go national. They want to have a wider audience. So that means they need to give up the cultural products of Shanghai dialect. That's not understood outside of Shanghai. So for artists, they want to go to Beijing. They want to have 1 billion followers, then 1 million followers. Then they need to ditch Shanghai dialect. So there is this interesting dynamic, I would say. I think that, I hope it answers Patricia's question.
Could I just add some?
Please, yeah, please.
Yeah. Another question I wanted an answer to is it possible that the clock can turn back? That this is not a sort of irrevocable move in one direction, but that other forces can bring out nativism ultimately. I was thinking of my own background in Australia. When I was brought up, we were actually sent to elocution classes to get us to speak English properly. And, that was what middle class, upper middle class, and educated people thought was really very desirable. So no matter how parents spoke, children would have to be groomed in correct pronunciation. It didn't take that long for a complete reversal in this movement, so that because I retained my somewhat my Englishized Australian accent, and one time when I went back, someone said, "Are you English or something?" And it wasn't very polite. And in fact, it comes in a whole context of, the community relations in Australia. Australian comedians take their accent abroad and cultivate it, amazingly in foreign parts. And it's become quite it's become a performative genre. So that if I really wanted to go back to my roots, I think I might have to learn to speak what they call strine all over again. I like to speak in strine because that's what everyone sort of thinks is a bit better. And, it would come with a whole lot of other intonations and so on. So it's not that necessarily that everything is in one direction for all history. There may be other things that can happen too, although, one can wonder as well. So that was just a glimpse. And the other question I really had was that I think that the monolingualism is a disease of modernity, and that what one needs really is to understand the function of language pluralism in making communities. That actually, it's not that everyone should be either speaking Putonghua or Shanghai dialect or some other dialect, but that social interactions are made from the negotiation of language in real life situations. You start off on one footing, you swap over another, you in different contexts, you do others. And that's part of the human creativity around language. So the idea that you would be altogether Shanghai dialect or altogether Putonghua or altogether something else is perhaps a sort of, it's not very good for the human condition or for the negotiation of social relationships. And I think in sociolinguistics, one of the really interesting things is to watch how people meet each other, how they react, how they change languages, in which contexts and to whom they use what, as you obviously have been doing in your work. And it's in the variety, not in the monolingualism, that you have a real reflection on creativity, the human condition, human relations, and all that sort of stuff. So this was my thought on that subject. Very fascinating presentation, very useful book. Obviously, I'm looking forward to reading it. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. I totally agree. To study language, we need to study the language actually used by participants, by practitioners. And then I do hope Shanghai dialect would be revived. There would be, as in your word, the clock turns back. But I'm not that optimistic because all these incentives people actually receive by speaking Putonghua. And then there is so it's kind of two forces. Top down, there's the state policy, and then from the bottom up, it's also induced by the state economic policy, is that there's real material return. And then people do not, Shanghainese, native Shanghainese, the younger generation, do not see the reason why they would use the Shanghai dialect. And there were some efforts, for example, a few years ago, there was the revival of a famous animation production. So that was like a TV series animation of like Black Cats sergeants. I watched it on TV when I was little. So it's in the 90s, 80s, 90s. And then there was a feature-length animation film to get more interest of the younger generation, from the younger generation about the dialect. It was screened in movie theaters in Shanghai. But the unfortunate thing was, first, the screening was only like 1 or 1.5% of all the the screening in the dialect counts only 1.5% of all the screening of that animation feature. And then the audience in those Shanghai dialect special screenings are parents of my generation, brought their children. However, the children were too young to read the subtitle in Mandarin, and then they couldn't understand the spoken Shanghai dialect either. And it feels like it has passed this points of no return. But I still have this little bit of hope. The dialect would survive, at least online, even though it's not in state-censored other media platforms. And then because the draconian COVID lockdown, I think there is lots of this negative sentiment against top-down state policies, and it might spread to the language sphere. And then there are YouTube songs on YouTube. We are live stream on YouTube. I was like, I don't have time to share those YouTube links of anti-COVID lockdown rap songs in Shanghai dialects. They not only post on Chinese social media, but they even post on YouTube. So there is some force resisting, but how much it can resist, how long it can resist against the whole state machine. As you said, the monolingualism is a modernist project, but it's also a nationalist project. And we know President Xi is very into this single association, let's say one country, one people, one language, that following all these modernist national ideologies, monolingual, monoglot ideologies. Yeah. Okay, yeah, thank you for the comment.
Thanks, Fang. I think this one nation, one policy is not just restricted to China. I think we have a lot of that in other parts of the world, and definitely some of those are quite relevant to India too. I think we have a couple of questions from Snigdha. Snigdha, you want to unmute and ask?
No, you may ask it from chat box.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so her question is to do with language proficiency and how it affects migrants' ability to benefit from urban redevelopment initiatives. And is there a discrimination being faced at local levels by the migrants in not knowing the language? And the second is on other ways in which redevelopment projects can be designed so as to preserve cultural and social identity of neighborhoods and perhaps the language itself.
Yeah, thank you. These two questions are more about urban redevelopments and then urban studies and then housing rights of migrants. As I mentioned, migrants, they can acquire the equivalence of like a green card in America, but it's green card to be in Shanghai. And so those policies has changed since 2004. Back in the Maoist era, right? People not born in a particular locale, they couldn't legally live and work there, and under the bigger framework of the household registration system. And then, like Professor Nards know well about those labor issues, and they don't have the local household registration system. Workers or laborers are not entitled to all sorts of benefits or Medicare as locals do. So that's same thing applied to the housing market. In Shanghai, it's even more, the disparity is even sharper because the housing price is so high. And then in a nutshell, the Shanghai locals or native Shanghainese with Shanghainese household registration system, when the economic reform started, the housing reform started, they were the sitting tenants of properties, apartment units owned by the state. And now we're transitioning from the planning economy to market economy. So how the state revitalized, kind of reinvent the housing market was selling those apartments at a heavily discount price to sitting tenants. So you can say that's the first pot of gold native Shanghainese got, which immigrants or migrants were not entitled to. We were talking about the 90s. We were talking about early 2000s, right? And then the newly developed, say, upscale condos and apartment buildings, they were sold at market price. That's in most cases way above internal migrants, laborers' salary. And then the last interview I showed, this upper middle class woman, she lived in an upscale condo being a migrant. Those are the super rich, like the upper middle class migrants. They could afford the market price. They are business owners. They have overseas experience. They are of a small percentage of migrants in Shanghai. So most migrants rent. They cannot rent in nice neighborhood. They rent in outskirts of the city. And there was used to be it used to be a saying that the inner circle, the most desirable high-end upscale neighborhood, if you walk around, you hear English. That means foreign expats. And then one ring outside of that, you hear Shanghai dialect, who, you know, even though socioeconomic status vary, but they can't afford the inner circle. But they're still within the city. They got displaced, but they got monetary compensation. They have kind of accumulated wealth because the early on the state policies. And then the outer ring, like those recently urbanized previous rural areas, there were apartment buildings built and there were extended public transit lines to those areas. If you go out in those places, you would hear 普通话, meaning that's where most migrants or migrant laborers live. So that's how urban geography is connected with the language spoken, because it's market economy. Who can afford the most desirable inner place are highly educated natives or then foreign expats. And then we just go a little bit out. Also, it corresponds to the language hierarchy in the country. So migrants, if they're college educated, the state changes policy almost every year. I talk to college graduates. They were like, oh, this year the policy says this or that quality I have, add more points. So I can apply for a Shanghai work permit or resident permit. But, you know, I got my permit 3 years ago with an undergrad degree. If I apply now with an undergrad degree, I won't get it anymore. I won't have enough points. So there's lots of anxiety and uncertainty because this policy changes every year. And then that's just talking about legally acquired right to live and work in the city. And then the next level up, if you have worked and lived in Shanghai and then pay into Social Security for 7 years, you can apply to get a Shanghai permanent permit. So, and that's almost like when you think about UK, Australia, or United States, that's immigrant policies, but we're still talking about within Chinese borders. So that's level of discrimination, you can say, within the legal system against its own citizens. And then it's allowed, actually, apparently, in China. And then I think the second question is, are there ways in which the redevelopment project can be designed so as to preserve the cultural and social identity of neighborhoods, perhaps language? Unfortunately, developers were not taking that into account, or even the municipal government or district governments leasing the land to developers, they didn't take that into account, mostly just who bid the highest, and then we'll give the land to that developer. And so what is preserved, interestingly, from my study, in some what we call displacee neighborhoods, right? In all those rounds of massive urban redevelopments, I mentioned more than 1 million Shanghainese households were displaced. Where to house them? Not everyone get the cash. Even if you get the cash, you can't just stay with your relatives for years, no end. So they need to move somewhere. Those eminent domain displaced Shanghainese, for certain rounds of those resettlements, they will be resettled into outskirts of urban Shanghai. And then those are apartment buildings with modern amenities. To give full credit, they were displaced from alleyway housing with no indoor plumbing. Now every household has their own apartments with indoor plumbing, even though it's outside of the city. There was the increase or enhanced the quality of life in terms of the living conditions, but they were displaced far away from the urban center, which they identified as home, which they bound their urban place identity. And then because those Shanghainese were not necessarily highly educated, were not necessarily working in white collar jobs in fancy CBD areas, they couldn't accumulate enough wealth to buy back into the inner core of the city. And then they were retirees, they just were left there, in a way, left in those displacee resettlement neighborhood. And those are the pockets actually of Shanghai dialect speaking. Not because any active policies to preserve the dialect, but this group of people, working class Shanghainese, they couldn't leave. So that's where actually the dialect was preserved. So I think maybe I answered the question.
Yes, thank you, Fang. Professor Acharya, I think she had a question. She's the director of the institute.
Okay. Well, I don't have a question really, because first of all, of course, I'd like to thank Fang Shu for getting up so early in the morning and still managing to look so bright and so focused and such a lucid kind of presentation. So I must say all admiration for that. I'm just reacting to some of the issues that came up in your talk, which go back to my study many years back about how the communists, and that this is obviously in the Maoist period, how they were dealing with Confucianism particularly, and how they had no place for Confucianism. And there was this very interesting thesis put forward by Levinson that at the end of the day, you are basically preserving it in a very artificial way, which has no connect with society, and you quote unquote museumify this whole legacy. And taking off from Patricia's point about the postmodern condition and the human language, I'm wondering whether we are not really moving towards eventually having all these dialects museumified as, objects of interest, and something happened. And one of our colleagues in the JNU, who's from linguistics, she went and she tried to codify this language in the Andamans. And she was compiled a dictionary of all the words. And interestingly, in one of the talks that I had attended, she was saying that all of about 50 people were left who were speaking that dialect. And therefore, she sat and she painstakingly compiled this dictionary. And she said, well, in another 50 years, maybe just one or two people. And even there, she found only one person, who was, I think, somewhere around 75, 80 or thereabouts, who actually could dredge up even more interesting words. So my point is that, is this an inevitable human condition as we move towards urbanization and absorption from different localities, and dialects inevitably would dwindle? I don't know how much effort can we take to preserve this, but really has no connection with the living life, as it were.
Yeah, I totally agree. So there was this project, I think, funded by National Geographic, and then they were sending researchers to various areas around the world to preserve indigenous language or minority languages by recording and creating dictionary. I was at a conference about endangered languages in University of Washington, Seattle, just last May, and researchers from Australia, Europe, and then Taiwan, and various, and then Central Asia, we're talking about languages with a few thousands of speakers. What can we do? And then what younger activists can do. And then there is this living language kind of website providing tools for people to create dictionaries themselves. But we all agree that for a language to be alive, it needs to be spoken. It cannot be stored in a museum or in archive. And then in terms of fates of the Shanghai dialects, I can see it still survive for a bit as a subculture, online subculture, because that's something unique. I want to tie it back into market economy, because that was the driving force for quicken the endangerment of the dialect. But on the other hand, we know the logic of market economy. If every product is uniform, it's the same, no one cares. So the product always try to, the producer of the products always try to find some market niche or something unique about the things they sell. Apply this logic to the cultural products. So what makes this influencer on social media unique and interesting, worth following, because this influencer used dialects or code switch between Putonghua and then Shanghai dialect or Cantonese or some other regional dialect. So that's interesting. And young people would follow that. Young people wouldn't follow, say, what teacher says, what government says. And, so that's kind of, what is the resistance against government policy? If it's communicating in the dialect, we will look into the dialects. So that's a bit my hope, as even though it would never become a lingua franca, return to be a lingua franca again, but at least it's alive in some subculture form. And then what is sad that after I published this book, I got contacted by people from kind of neighboring regions in the Yangtze River Delta. And they were saying that, what you describe is the same happening in my hometown, like in Hangzhou or in smaller cities. They're like, or Suzhou even. They're like, no one cares, it's fine, see all the material wealth, how well we live now. And then if language is the price, it's okay. So to me, I feel it's sadder because Shanghai, as China scholars might know, have all this pride of being a Shanghainese. We're so unique, better, blah, blah, blah. So there is this kind of more incentive or cultural identity associated with the dialects for Shanghainese, but it's not necessarily so for Wu Chinese or other variation of Mandarin dialects associated with smaller places. So this connection with a famed city doesn't exist for those variations of Mandarin Chinese dialects. And then I think there was less effort to revive, to maintain those variations. Yeah, that's my observation.
Yeah, rather somber picture, but well, what to do? I mean, that's the logic of the market. Thank you very much. That's very fascinating, of course.
Sorry, Akshat has a question.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Shu, thank you so much for a most informative session. I have two questions, the first feeding into the second. Language and identity are invariably intertwined. And this top-down imposition of Putonghua in this case, Shanghai, would you say that it is a way of limiting regional identity and promoting a more national identity? And secondly, would you see a potential negative backlash from local communities with political connotations? Because we've seen something similar in India when a top-down approach of, say, imposing a particular language in a particular region has invited a lot of backlash. So would you see this also happening with potential political connotations, in this case in Shanghai or in other places in China? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I would say the uniqueness about Shanghai dialect is that it's not indigenous, it's relatively new. It has only, this Shanghai dialect is an urban variation of the Wu Chinese language. So by itself, it has been more than 100 years of history. It's not associated with an ethnicity, with a religion, with indigeneity or hundreds of years of local history. So it doesn't have all these other cultural elements to rally political support, to fight against other regions or the central government. Also, a bit about Shanghai's history is, like I mentioned, Shanghai dialect only have a relatively short history. In the early 20th century, 85%, more than 85% of the residents in Shanghai are migrants. So the history was cosmopolitan with varied regional origins, or no one in Shanghai, I would say, can trace 3 or 4 generations back saying that, oh, we are native Shanghainese. No one really. Everyone was a descendant of immigrants. So in that sense, it's very hard to articulate or even say weaponize this local identity for political purposes, because in a way, you don't necessarily have this ground or roots. And so that's kind of, I think my answer to your second question, whether there could be a political results or as a tool for rallying against other regions or states politically, using identity as a weapon. And well, the first question is language and identity. Sorry, I didn't write it down. Could you repeat the first question again?
The first question was, so language and identity are invariably intertwined. So would you say that this top-down approach of imposing Putonghua, in this case in Shanghai, Can it be seen as limiting regional identity and promoting a more national Chinese identity, not just in Shanghai, but say in other provinces and other cities?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me. Yes, I would say the answer is absolutely yes. And they are, I mean, the central government is really fabricating this national identity, right? It's not just try to wipe out the regional difference. They also trying to articulate this 中华民族 or the race of Chinese, if you want to translate into. And then, so in that way, the 中华民族, they were talking about kind of the Han Chinese, but also in a way we're saying that all the minorities are part of this country and trying to, in a way, the way I see, I'm Manchurian, actually, I'm not Han Chinese, try to eliminate even the difference between Han Chinese and the minorities, saying now we're all in this country together, we support the Chinese Communist Party, and then there shouldn't be regional difference. And then back to Patricia's points about modernism and one country, one language. And then I didn't do anything research about religious oppression on religious beliefs, but there are a lot of literature on that as well in China studies. So there is this uniform identity being Chinese. I think that has been promoted through various venues. In the book, I talk about there is this annual 普通话 promotion week. So it's the third week of September. We're almost approaching this week. And then it has all these slogans every year. It was associate 普通话 speaking with not only social mobility, loyalty to the party, loyalty to the country, and also the China dream, also this kind of the national community. So all these keywords you can find in the slogan. And it's not just a week a year when the slogan is populated on social media or state accounts on those social media. There are all sorts of activities. If you look up that week-long events were sponsored by 9 ministries or ministry level bureaus and offices. So it involves education, cultural, and then broadcasting, even military. And what activities they would hold nationwide is kind of equivalence to like spelling bees or public cultural performance, reciting ancient poems or prose, and then in Mandarin Chinese, really use the opportunity to promote this kind of fabricated Chinese culture. And dialect preservation activists sometimes will point out, saying that, you know what, that poem was written 1,000 years ago. If you read it in Mandarin Chinese, it actually doesn't rhyme. It rhymes when you read it out in a dialect, because that was closer to the ancient Chinese. And there's various activities through schools, through state-owned corporations and agencies, and with all these nationwide effort to promote this uniform identity. Yeah.
Thank you, Fang. Are there any more questions? Okay, thank you. So maybe I'll give it the finishing kick it needed. I was quite fascinated by the last point you talked about, especially with the Putunghua week, because even in India we have something called the Hindi week, so there's a lot of similarities there. The same, all those which you mentioned are also carried out here, especially in all the central government offices or schools administered by the central government. This is mandatory. So, I mean, more ways than in one. I think India and China are joined at the hip, as we would like to say. But I think this entire notion of dialects versus language is also quite interesting, because there is the politics of what you call as a dialect and what you call as a language, and how languages become, I mean, how dialects are might be languages, but they are called dialects. The politics of that, we have that in India too. A lot of languages which were there in northern part of India today are called dialects of Hindi. I'm sure that's also the same for a lot of other languages in the country too. But this entire notion of what you term as a dialect and what you call as a language, the definition or the way of defining itself, the politics to it is it's quite interesting. So I think I'll just end. In fact, I wanted to also talk about the essay which I in fact read in preparing for your talk. Especially, I was quite fascinated with how Putong and Pushi and how the river itself is a dividing factor, and what got more of that. But this is that, I think maybe that's for another day. So maybe my final point is what the question which I wanted to ask is both from what Professor Acharya and Professor Oberoi were talking about in terms of museumization of languages, or even this language pluralism. So to mix with Shanghai as a city, and how you said 85% is migrants, and all the case studies you just presented of various levels of people. But migrants also, if that's the main thing of migrants being rural migrants, or the Nungsun or the agrarian workers,
Yes.
How do they approach? I mean, for example, Shanghai, the internal migrations can happen from various provinces, right? So there can be the regional quote unquote dialects which come in, whether it is Sichuanese, whether it is Cantonese. So it's not just Putonghua or Shanghainese. There is also this third variable which comes in terms of dialects, or in terms of what these migrant labor brings into the city. So in that mix, with this third variable of these regional dialects, or even languages, if you could call them, are coming into play, how does that then problematize or complicate this matrix, and how does that happen? Because even in India, or even otherwise, I think the migrants might come in, but they will be forced to take up whichever is language, because it's ultimately the bottom line is survival. So how does that then take place, or is there a way out with all these three languages or dialects in play? What would be the effect?
Yeah. Yes. Quickly, for those still staying with us, I think I can share two vignettes, two observations about migrant workers. So we're not talking about white collar, highly educated. We're talking about manual laborers, and then they work at construction sites, they work as street vendors, they work in retail or in restaurants, right?
Yes.
So what I observed is that, so first, they are of the prime age, they are the laborers. So most of them, I would say, finish elementary school, 6 years of education. They can read and write, and then they encountered Mandarin in their school system in their hometown. And then coming to Shanghai, most of them live in the outskirts, and they don't necessarily interact with the native Shanghainese population. I interviewed even say those small companies, and they have a receptionist. She is from outside. She could be, I interviewed one, she is the daughter of a construction worker. So her father is the first generation of migrants to Shanghai in the 90s, and now finishing middle school, she joined the parents in Shanghai. And she has, unfortunately, in her social circle, no native Shanghainese. And then, but she befriended with other internal migrants of her age. They're coming from all across the country. But there seem to be not only the language-based, but also social class-based barrier. But working class Shanghainese do not necessarily interact with working class migrant workers either. And then they would use Mandarin Chinese at work, client-facing kind of, but some of them actually acquired working level, basic level of Shanghai dialects, say street vendors. They want to communicate with old Shanghainese living, they go into residential neighborhood to sell fruits and sell stuff. So they could talk to elderly Shanghainese who do not speak Putonghua well in basic Shanghai dialect. That's for their business. And then within this migrants community, it's interesting that some of them acquire the Shanghai dialect a little bit, and then they use that to judge other migrants, saying that almost like the notion of you are more fresh off the boat than I am. See, I have lived in Shanghai for years. I already can say some small can say some sentences in simple, I can speak simple Shanghainese and you couldn't. So you are less Shanghai than I am. I'm a little bit above you within the migrant community. So that's what I observe. You know, what do they call? Every minority has its own minority. Yeah.
Thanks. That's also quite revealing and insightful. Again, I feel that might be here across the board. So thanks, Dr. Shu. It was really a pleasure. It was fascinating to listen to your talk. I think, and also, even though it's a Labor Day holiday and in the US, at least on the Western coast, but being up so early, that itself reserves a special appreciation. So thank you so much. And on behalf of the ICS, let me thank. And now I'll hand over to Akshat for the finishing part, I guess.
Thank you so much, sir. With this, we come to the end of today's session. We thank Dr. Fang Shu and Dr. Krishnan for gracing us with their presence today. The video of today's discussion shall be available on the ICS's YouTube channel. We would also like to welcome all of you to the 15th Giri Dishankar Memorial Lecture, which will be held on the 6th of September, that is this Wednesday. The title of this special lecture will be Liberal Democracy and Confucianism, Creating a Hybrid for the 21st Century, and will feature Dr. Thungthung Bai as the speaker. We hope to see all of you over there. Thank you so much for joining us. At the same time, you may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you so much.
Yeah, same.